I welcome you to the library, the Ortigas Library, and we have over 24,000 volumes now of books, maps, prints, photographs, and we serve the general public. And for those who don't know about us yet or never used our services, please do. You can come in, and all you have to do is ask for the book or things that you're doing research on, and we will provide you. We have librarians here to help you. It's a closed library, so you can't come in and just play around in our shelves here. Tonight, of course, is a very tense night. So we were worried about your health, just as I was very much worried. Aside from getting the exhibit ready, I was also worried about your health. So if you notice, we made sure that we didn't get the seats too close to one another. So we're trying to follow the protocol of, I think it's 1 meter apart. I don't think it's fully 1 meter, maybe 3/4 of a meter. But as long as you don't cough on each other, I think we'll have a good night.
You know when your cough is coming, so you have to cough around.
Also, or if you're gonna cough, please do it outside. Then we made sure an hour before we disinfected everything. Reminds me, I was telling Mr. Montilla that reminds me of whenever I'd go to Army Navy Club or John Hay, you go to the bathrooms and it always smells like Lysol. You know, it was very much a Lysol thing. So now I'm an expert on Lysol. I know what is the parts to water and parts to Lysol, and I think I can also disinfect any place else in the world now. We also made sure that the food was wrapped individually, so that none of you are just going to play around with the potato chips. Now you have your own little basket of food, and then of course we're live streaming the talk tonight of Professor Jose, live stream, and at the same time, and if you have your cell phone and you want to just text your friends on Facebook that it's on Facebook, our Facebook page. We'll live stream this at 6 o'clock tonight. And then we will also record it and we will upload it to YouTube in our, so that, for those I know who had really trepidations about coming, and I totally understand that they can at least see Professor Jose's talk. Professor Rico Jose is somebody that I've known for a while, and I'm really very proud of him. Ever since I came 20 years ago when I knew him, he was already a Japanese expert, and Mr. Montilla also tells me he was a Japanese expert even before that. Japan-Philippine expert, especially World War II. And so, given the cancellation of Mr. Scott, James Scott, who was boarding his plane, and was told to stop and not board the plane because they and his group were heading for parts unknown, maybe possibly full of the virus. So he had to go back, and he was very apologetic. I was so happy that I was able to call on Professor Jose, and he answered that he would be able to fill in the vacuum, and I'm really thankful to Professor Jose because his talk tonight on Manila, the liberation after 3 years of a harrowing occupation, is so apropos to the exhibition that we have outside. Thank you, Professor Jose, for doing this. The exhibition, when I was growing up, when I was a little child, there were many alive storytellers. There was the houseboys and the drivers, and they all had guns, and they all killed so many Japanese, and there were so many incredible stories of their lives and how it was under Japanese occupation. Although my mother didn't want to talk too much about it because it hurt a lot, but so there were people, live people, telling us about it. Well, it's now 3 generations later, and those live people have gone, and now there are very few, and so the storytellers now become the books, the maps, the prints, the photographs, etc. They're the ones that are going to remind us on our 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Philippines, why it's important for us to remember. So, I also want to thank PHIMCOS, who is our co-sponsor to this exhibit. PHIMCOS is the Philippine Map Society of the Philippine Map Collectors Society, PHIMCOS. And we are members, and some of our board members are also members of PHIMCOS. And I've learned a lot about appreciating our maps. We have a map collection, so PHIMCOS has been so good to us in helping us form the exhibition. We also want to thank Marga Binamira, who collected and lent us the Proto Martir photographs, and then maps by Peter Geldart, who is also a PHIMCOS member, and then Mr. Montilla, who is both a PHIMCOS member and our board member, and so much of his collection is here, and then our own collection, which is pretty much books and a few maps. So I hope you get a chance after the talk to go around it, and hopefully we'll be open until the next few weeks, although I hear this lockdown talk, so I don't know, but stay tuned, and if you can make it here, and if we're open, do come by, because we're going to keep this up for a couple of weeks. Is there a parallel to World War II and the situation today? I don't know. I couldn't think of a parallel to World War II. All I could think of was that that was a very painful and harrowing situation for our country, and imposed from the outside. But this thing of the virus is also another phenomenon that we just have to address and confront. And hopefully we all get together and be cooperative and make sure that we follow all those rules now that are being imposed on us for the good reason. Social distancing, washing your hands, it seems like very basic, so that our country will be a little bit unscathed. I don't think we will be fully unscathed, but I know that we don't want to have the same kind of figures that Korea or Italy is suffering today. So with that, I thank you again all for coming, for braving that stupid virus out there, and that I would like to introduce you to Professor Rico Jose of the University of the Philippines.
Okay, thank you for the short introduction. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Magandang hapon o magandang gabi sa inyong lahat. And since it's now 75 years ago, since all these events happened, let me also say minasan konnichiwa. We are now more into understanding. We should understand each other. We have undergone 75 years of trying to forget this. I think it was 25 years ago that it started to come back to life. Actually, the Battle of Manila had been neglected for a long time. Very few people wanted to talk about it. The memorials that were there years ago, many of them are gone, the ones I used to know, and the other signs that the battle had been fought have gradually disappeared. But there are other signs, there are other memorials, and so let me take you back to that particular period. I will not be going into the atrocities and the massacres in detail. I guess if Jim Scott was here, he would be able to do that. I'll do it a little bit, but I won't go into the details. But I'll try to analyze why it happened, what happened then, what was the logic behind some of this, and place it into a perspective. What Manila was like then, and what Manila was like at the end of the war. So, this is actually a variant of a presentation I did a couple of weeks ago. And, of course, I did not experience the war personally. We have a few members of the audience here who actually were there during the war. I was born after the war, but I had heard all these stories. And the one thing about before the war was that Manila was seen as the Pearl of the Orient. It was a modern city with different districts, Spanish traces, American influences, different cultural areas. It was a thriving commercial center, very cosmopolitan, very democratic, very liberal. And just to remind us of what it was like just before the war, the Philippines was in what was called the Philippine Commonwealth. And that was the preparatory stage towards independence in 1946, and that began in 1935. So the president at that time was Manuel Quezon, and there were new buildings going up. I think the one thing that most of us failed to understand about Manila in 1941 was there were so many new buildings that were going up, and people were very proud of those new buildings. The Manila City Hall had just been finished. What became known as the agricultural building and the old finance building, those had just been completed. Part of the Burnham plan, they had run out of money, but those had been completed. There were really white buildings, they were gleaming white. We were all proud of it, and I'll show a few pictures later on. And those new buildings were a sign of a future that the Philippines was moving into. Manila itself was important historically, politically, militarily, and symbolically. This is a picture, an area picture of Manila. I was looking for pictures to show what Manila looked like, and when I found this, I immediately used it, but actually this is in the late 1920s. This was not the Manila of 1941. Why do we know this? North Harbor is not yet there. You'll see the piers of North Harbor are not yet there. And the big government buildings that were there in 1941 are not yet here. So the Manila City Hall, what are now the buildings of the National Museum, those are not yet there. Some of the bridges are not yet there either. But this does show you what Manila was like, bisected by the Pasig River, the poorer side in Tondo over there, but the business district of Escolta was very clearly marked by the buildings, and then the old area of Intramuros and the more American area of Malate and Ermita further south. So insofar as the newer buildings were concerned, this was the old Congress building, but it was designed as the National Library building. So the thing was, this was supposed to be our National Library. And the Congress took it over, unfortunately. But it did remain as part of the National Library for quite a long time. And that came up in the 1920s, but it was the first of these big buildings that were coming up in central Manila. Another thing we were very proud of was the new bridges. And this was the latest bridge to cross the Pasig. This was built in 1940, Quezon Bridge. And Quezon, in fact, inaugurated this bridge on his birthday in 1940, not cutting the ribbon because that would have been too simplistic. So what they did was they used a chain, and Quezon used a blowtorch to cut the chain, and that opened the Quezon Bridge put it into operation. So these were the new buildings, and we were proud of them, and we were proud, okay, in 10 years, by 1946, the Philippines will be independent, very cosmopolitan, people were living together, the economy was doing well, and then all of a sudden, war came around. Manila was bombed, Manila was declared an open city on December 26, but the Japanese continued to bomb Manila nonetheless. And the Commonwealth government went into exile, first into Corregidor, and eventually into the United States. And we'll not deal too much in what happened right after the war, that's another topic entirely, but let's just look at some pictures. On the top left, you have the old, this was the old Santo Domingo church hit by Japanese bombs and burning. And the picture on the right shows people in Tutuban Station trying to escape Manila, trying to get out, waiting for trains that had already been seized by the military, and so they were unable to get out. Again, fortunately, we are not in this bad a situation yet. Hopefully we don't ever have to get to this particular point. But looking at the picture of Santo Domingo Church burning, when I looked at it again, it reminded me of Notre Dame burning also. And this was one of those more beautiful relics that we had that never was rebuilt after the war. It was never rebuilt, and it was a total loss. And then, although Manila was declared an open city, the Japanese continued to bomb it through Christmas Day and December 28 and so forth, until they finally occupied Manila. So this is one of the earlier pictures that the Japanese actually took when they entered Manila. We know that this was taken when the Japanese were already in Manila because you'll see behind a Japanese truck and you'll see Japanese soldiers in the picture. So it is a picture that the Japanese took as a propaganda picture, but the sign Open City was still there. Now, when the Japanese took over, they instituted a military government, what that they call the Japanese Military Administration. And under this, they placed the Philippine Executive Commission. And the Japanese in their military government put controls everywhere. Economic controls, controls on culture, the press, politics. They established what is called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And then to try to win Philippine allegiance, they declared the Philippines independent in 1943 under Jose P. Laurel. But the whole thing about this was fear and uncertainty. And John mentioned what are some of the connections between past and present. I think one thing that is still with us today is the uncertainty of everything. So today we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. During the war, it was similar to that. There was a great deal of uncertainty. Would the Japanese come to your house? Would they raid you? Would they arrest friends you knew? That was unknown. So the Japanese did try to win friends. They issued propaganda leaflets like this, peace return to the Philippines, and they showed friendly Japanese. But if one looked at these pictures, it seemed like nothing was wrong. You'd see the friendly Japanese soldier. There were friendly Japanese soldiers, yes. You'd see the friendly Japanese soldiers with the ice cream vendor there. But the reality was not quite like that. The reality was, of course, okay, this is the Congress building now with the Philippine Republic being inaugurated in October 43. But the reality were these Japanese sentries all over the place. Japanese soldiers who were very strict, had their guns, fixed bayonets, and so forth. And the thing about this was that for the Japanese sentries, you had to bow in front of them. And we had not bowed to other people before. We didn't bow in front of the Spaniards. We didn't bow in front of the Americans. And now we had to bow in front of the Japanese. And if you couldn't understand what they said, they would call you back. And if you still couldn't understand it, slap you. So the one thing that turned most of the Japanese off, or turned most of the Filipinos off to the Japanese, was that they couldn't understand what they were saying, and if they couldn't understand, they slapped you. We had never ever been slapped by our colonizers. The Americans didn't slap us, the Spaniards didn't slap us. Maybe if you became too fresh with your girlfriend, you might get slapped, but it didn't normally happen. And here, you were being slapped for no reason at all. So the Japanese were all over the place in positions of power like this. And they brought in their own money, the Mickey Mouse money, so-called. These are still very much available, and they still are worth very little. The pictures of the three on top were the first issue. They were brought in by the Japanese when they landed, and you'll notice that they're very simple. No promise of being paid, no backing of gold or silver, nothing. And they were easy to counterfeit. So within 1 month, some of them were counterfeited already. So the controlled newspaper had to say, if you're caught with a fake bill, you will be executed. And so it was that kind of thing. A friend of mine who was collecting money at that time was so excited when he saw the new bills that he traded his pre-war money for the new Japanese money. And when his mother found out about that, she scolded, get that money back because this is going to be useless. So later on, 1942, the Japanese instituted serial numbers and they changed. The design that you see here these abaca. These are abaca plantations from Davao. And then they changed it to the Rizal monument here so that it seemed a little more Filipino. But again, didn't make too much sense. Even with the serial numbers, it didn't command too much of a price. I'm a millionaire twice fold because one of my grand aunts, after she passed away, gave me, her successors, her descendants gave me a whole box of money. And when I counted it, it was about 1 million pesos worth of Japanese money. So I said, oh, nice, but you can't spend it. So anyway, this is the stuff that for those people who remember that, those people who survived that would remember that there was so much inflation that took place. One couldn't even buy rice properly. One had to stand in line. Everything was rationed. Everything was controlled. So one of the jokes that came out there actually was, what did the Spaniards bring? Religion. What did the Americans bring? Education. And what did the Japanese bring? Ration. So that was the joke then, because everything was rationed. And sometimes people just fell in line not knowing what the lines were for. And sometimes they'd line up for something not knowing, they thought it was for soap or shampoo or something. And when they got there to the end, they found it was for matches. And so things like that were in short supply. Matches, cooking oil, everything that we needed was suddenly in very short supply. And people started bringing money in the bayongs. And later in the war, the vendors didn't even bother to count them, and you bartered one bayong for whatever you were buying. If you didn't accept all that, then this is what would happen to you. If you were seen as a looter or someone disturbing the peace, you could be brought and tied up together like these three unfortunate youths. This is, I think, somewhere in Isaac Peral. And this is a Chinese torture system actually, where you were put together and paraded around. And that's how bad the transportation system became in Manila by late 1944. Today we complain about crowding in the MRT or the LRT. It's not that this bad, at least. It's never gotten that bad. But when you get to Christmas rush, people get in the buses and so forth. But this picture was taken during one of the worst times of the period of the late Japanese occupation. People were dying in those streetcars because some could not hold on and some fell down and were run over by the tranvia. So as all of that was happening, there was a strong resistance movement. And of course the promise of MacArthur to return was very strong, weighed very heavily on many Filipinos. So there were various guerrilla resistance groups in Manila. Some were for actual physical attacks. The others were more psychological. They brought out propaganda materials. And the others would bring in this faith in MacArthur's eventual return. And by September of 1944, the waiting seemed to have was almost over as American air raids began to come in Manila. It's very interesting to note that the first American air raid on Manila was on September 21, 1944. And that same day, because the Americans had bombed Manila, the Japanese forced Laurel to do something that he didn't personally want to do, declare war. He did not declare war, he declared a state of war. But before he did that, he did one other thing. He declared martial law. And again, the play on dates, September 1944, September 1972, almost to the day 21, you have that martial law declaration going on. But to make that so-called declaration of state of war useless, Laurel told all of the members of the cabinet and members of the National Assembly to go back, go home. So it was never ratified. And under our Constitution, it had to be ratified before it could be legal. So the American air raids began to come. And by this time, the Japanese were sending reinforcements to the Philippines because by this time, the Japanese knew that the Philippines was going to be the decisive battleground in the Pacific. So these are examples of some of what the guerrillas were circulating in, at least the one on the left was being circulated in Manila. That was being printed in the mountains of Quezon province, Mount Banao specifically, and was put out by a group called President Quezon's own guerrillas. The poster on the right, we have a real version of this outside. You can look at it later on. It was drawn by a Filipino who was working in Hollywood. That's why it looks like a Hollywood movie poster. But it did show that the Filipinos were fighting for freedom. And note the flag, it's the red side up. So we were at war. And by October of 1944, MacArthur was back on Philippine shores, except that he was in Leyte, and that was still very far from Manila. That did bring in a lot of joy to Filipinos at that time, but it would still be a matter of time before he actually got to the other places. So when MacArthur got to Luzon, that would now be January 9. The fighting in Leyte would have taken up much longer than what the Americans expected, and the Japanese in fact decided to send their best troops to Leyte, even from Luzon, from Manchuria, from China, from Japan. They sent their best troops and they went to Leyte, and the others stayed in Luzon. So there were quite a number of Japanese troops that were in the Philippines at that time. In January 9, 1945, the MacArthur's forces landed in Lingayen, and the first target would have been Manila. But he had to pass all the towns going south towards Manila, and the difficulty there was he would have to pass Pangasinan, and through Pangasinan to Tarlac, and eventually to Pampanga and Bulacan. And the Japanese had put up strong positions in the mountains covering some of that. So in Tarlac, if you pass the Bamban area, for example, the mountains are overlooking the highway. The Japanese were there fighting. And the unknown quantity there was that the Japanese were in bulk in the mountain province, in the Baguio area, also overlooking the Central Plains. And nobody knew what their plans were. So the general in command of the forces moving southwards, General Kruger, had to be very cautious, and he had to move slowly. MacArthur was incensed at the slowness of that drive, that sometimes MacArthur would even go ahead of the first troops of General Kruger's soldiers and say there's nothing here. But in the military, you're always told to watch your flanks, because the Japanese might come from the side and catch you by surprise. So in any case, MacArthur wanted to reach Manila as soon as possible, and even, if possible, by his birthday. That would have been in late January 1945. He didn't make it on his birthday. But he had his own dreams of what to do when he got to Manila. That was to mount a very great victory parade. The plans were made. The map was there and everything, who was to participate in the parade and everything. That was assuming the Japanese would not defend Manila. But what the Americans didn't know was that the Japanese had other plans. And when you look at the Japanese command structure at that time, the Army and the Navy were quite separate from each other. They were rivals. In fact, the rivalry between the Japanese Army and the Navy was so bad that some of their parts could not even fit. The Japanese Army's guns were slightly different from the Japanese Navy guns. And you couldn't use the bullets of the Navy in the Army guns and so forth. The Japanese Navy didn't want to transport Japanese Army troops, and so the Army had to come up with its own ships as well. And so that rivalry between the two groups was something that was really... we hear in the United States, there's that rivalry between Annapolis and West Point. They always have that big game, big football game in which they really fight it out. But in the case of the Japanese Army and the Navy, they were really extremely jealous of each other. No one wanted to be under the other. And so in the Japanese case, General Yamashita was the overall army commander in the Philippines, but there was an overall Japanese Navy commander by the name of Admiral Okochi, and they were supposed to be almost on equal terms. Technically, land warfare, the Navy had to be under the Army, but the Navy hated that. And to make things even worse was the commander of the Japanese Navy garrison in Manila was a person by the name of Admiral Iwabuchi. And Iwabuchi was somebody who was a brilliant naval officer up until 1942. Graduate of the Naval Academy, he had good record as a naval commander, and he had risen up to be a battleship commander in 1942. Unfortunately for him, his battleship was sunk in the South Pacific in 1942, and he survived. And for a Japanese Navy officer, that was probably the worst thing to happen to one. Following the British tradition, you go down with the ship, or the Japanese tradition, you go down with your ship. In his case, the ship was capsizing, he was thrown off, he was unconscious, and he was rescued. His men died. And so what was his assignment after that? He was sent to an air base as a personnel officer. Imagine you're a captain of a battleship, and then suddenly you become personnel officer on an airfield, you don't know how to fly, you know nothing about flying, you are never trained for that. And then all of a sudden you're put in this really out-of-the-way place in northern Japan, cold winters and all that. And he was frozen. It's really very unfortunate for him. And then, when the Americans landed in Leyte, he was all of a sudden assigned, go to Manila, you will command the naval garrison in Manila. And when he arrived in Manila, he said, this is where I'm going to die. I'm not going to survive this. This is my dying place. So, General MacArthur, of course, very egoistic, classic picture of himself with his corncob pipe and everything. This was taken in Manila, in fact, after the fighting. You can see the ruins of actually the Congress building behind him, but that has been obscured. You'll notice also that by this time he's wearing the five-star insignia, so he'd just been promoted to 5-star general. So on the other side, you'd have the Japanese commanders, General Yamashita and Admiral Iwabuchi. Now, General Yamashita was another interesting character because he had won against the British in Malaya and in Singapore. He was the victor of Singapore. He had won in a very brief period of time, and because of that, the Japanese High Command in Tokyo felt threatened that he might become a political threat to the Japanese government. So after his victory in Singapore, he was posted to Manchuria and kept there frozen for 3 years. Nothing happened there in 3 years. And then all of a sudden, when Manila was being attacked by planes, he was sent here. You command the Philippine garrison. And he studied right away, what will we do? And his own conclusion was, we'll defend Luzon. Put everything in Luzon. Not defend the beaches, but we go into the mountains, hide out there, tie the Americans down, prevent them from using those troops in Japan. We'll tie down as many troops as we can. What happened was, when Leyte was invaded, Tokyo told him send everyone to Leyte. And so he had to follow those orders. But still, he had a considerable number of men that he put in the mountains. So you'll see most of the Japanese defended the mountainous areas, mountain provinces area. Montalban, they were up there. The Zambales Mountains, they were there. The Bicol area, they also were in the mountains. But Admiral Iwabuchi had other plans, and that was to defend the city of Manila. Yamashita would order Iwabuchi and the Navy people to get out of Manila, but Iwabuchi would say the naval orders had precedence over the army orders. Again, look at the Army-Navy rivalry there. And to him, the Navy orders said destroy anything that the Americans can use. That would mean the piers, the roads, the bridges, because they knew that Manila would be used as a major naval base for the next invasion that the Americans would plan. And so Iwabuchi was ordered to destroy as much of Manila as he could. And he would take those orders literally. So as most of the Japanese army men were moving out of Manila by December of 1944, the Navy was digging in, building trenches, and fortifying buildings. This is a captured Japanese map which shows the dispositions that the Japanese were in. There was a small group at the port, the pier area. That was, of course, they would have to destroy the piers over here. And they were in the Ermita Malate area, also that was strategically important to them. And of course, the Intramuros area. And down to the south, this is where you have, this is the airport today. This is Villamor Field. At that time, it was Nichols Field. And then a small group of people in Makati, the Nielsen Field area. And interestingly also, the Mandaluyong Psychopathic Hospital. So there were certain areas that they were really very determined to hold. And later on, when some of these positions were overrun, the Americans found rice good for 6 months, at least. And so they were really there to stay. So, the battle began on February 3, 1945, when the 1st Cavalry Division sent a special unit called the Flying Column to bypass the Japanese positions in central Luzon, and instead of taking the MacArthur Highway, what now the MacArthur Highway today, go via Nueva Ecija and then use the alternative route going to Novaliches, and from Novaliches going to Manila. They didn't know how to get there, actually, so once they reached part of Manila, they met with some guerrillas who guided them to Santo Tomas. And one of them, Colaiko, guided them to the gates of Santo Tomas, and there the Japanese were caught by surprise, but they reacted very quickly. They threw grenades, they fired a few guns, and Colaiko was shot in the process. Eventually, he was brought to a hospital and died a few days later. So you have two divisions coming into Manila, the 1st Cavalry, which moved in very quickly, and the 37th Infantry Division, which was a little slower, more careful. They came in from MacArthur Highway, and one of the places that they reached just before the battle began was the old Balintawak Beer Brewery, which is now San Miguel. And naturally, when they came across the brewery, they had to stop there and drink the beer, which was still cold. The Balintawak Beer Brewery was incidentally a pre-war Japanese company in the Philippines, but whether it was Japanese beer or whatever, it was still beer. And once the two divisions began entering Manila, then the Japanese began to blow the bridges. So if we look at the map, once you get the bridges between the north and the south blown, there is no way to cross the river except by boat. And so the Japanese blew the bridges. They began burning Tondo and Binondo, especially the Escolta area. And in Intramuros, the men started to be brought to Fort Santiago, and the killings began. So to say that the Japanese were killing because they were losing was not true. They already began killing very early in the fighting, as the fighting was beginning. Now, MacArthur and his men wanted to reach Santo Tomas as soon as possible because there had already been cases where the Japanese had massacred American prisoners of war. The classic one would have been the Palawan Massacre or the Puerto Princesa Massacre. This had happened in December, and American prisoners of war were forced into air raid shelters. Gasoline was poured on them, and they were burned alive. Only about 11 managed to escape, but the rest of them were killed. That was a problem, that was a possibility that the other prisoners of war and internees might also be killed by the Japanese in a similar manner. So one thing that happened before this was the raid on Cabanatuan, where the Americans sent rangers to Cabanatuan and rescued the prisoners of war there. And then as the fighting was going on here, they would send another force to Los Baños to rescue the internees there. So this is a picture taken shortly after the Americans had reached Santo Tomas the next day, and you'd see that the children are now wearing American helmets and so forth. Now, the American helmets by 1944-45 were different from the American helmets in the early part of the war. When the war started, we were still using, at least the soldiers were fortunate enough to be using them, they were using the old World War I helmets, the ones that looked like soup plates. So those were the helmets we were familiar with. When the Americans came in 1945, they were using the new helmets as we see here. And some of the people in Manila didn't even know what these helmets were, and some even thought the Germans are here because they looked like German helmets. So at first there was a shock, and then they realized, oh, but these are Americans. And so very soon after, the American flag was flown on Santo Tomas. The Japanese were not sleeping, and they immediately began to fire at Santo Tomas. They had artillery pieces in the port area in Intramuros, and to them, the tower of Santo Tomas was something that they could see very clearly. It was a very good aiming point. So a few days after the 1st Cavalry got to Santo Tomas, shells landed in Santo Tomas, killing some of the internees who had survived 3 years of internment. Now they were killed by Japanese shells that landed just as they were liberated. And as the Americans were consolidating their position in Santo Tomas, the Japanese began to burn everything they could. This was taken from the tower of Santo Tomas, and you can see the flames there. You can see San Sebastian Church, but all of these other items that are burning are ammunition dumps, oil supplies, and other items. So by this time, the Americans couldn't do anything about it because they were stuck. They didn't have enough forces yet The other forces would come in 1 day, 2 days later. So all they had basically was Santo Tomas. Another unit went to Malacanang Palace, was able to rescue that very quickly. And another unit tried to cross the Pasig River in Quezon Bridge, but the Japanese blocked them in FEU, Far Eastern University. And then they began to burn the houses, especially the houses in Santa Cruz, in Tondo, and Binondo. Interesting picture, this one, because this is part of Chinatown, and it's going up in flames, and the Japanese have set up starting to burn the area. People are starting to escape, bringing what they can, and yet that one person on the left is smiling at the camera. So it's one of those interesting pictures that, you know, your house is probably going to be burned in a few minutes, and yet you see the camera and you smile at the camera. We don't know the others. Look, the others are really panicking. They're trying to get things out, trying to get what they can out of their houses and so forth. This map shows where the Americans were stopped. They were coming from Quezon Boulevard here. Far Eastern University was fortified by the Japanese, and so this was a major stumbling block before they could even reach Quezon Bridge. And by the time they could get there, the bridge was blown already. But you had mines in the road, and you had all these other fortifications blocking them, so they were stuck there. Another interesting picture, this is Rizal Avenue, early days of the fighting. These houses are still there, actually. But again, look, there's a Japanese sniper farther down the road. He's firing, and you have men of the U.S. Army seeking shelter, trying to shoot the sniper. And yet, in the second floor, you have the residents of the houses looking out as if it was an ordinary thing. So this is one of those interesting pictures that shows something serious is happening, and yet people are making usyoso. These are pictures taken in Ongpin. Now you go to Ongpin today, you can't see this because it's too crowded, all these stalls around there. But here the stalls, because the Japanese were burning the place, they were totally abandoned. And you have an anti-tank gun here on the bottom. It's pointing towards Santa Cruz Church at the bottom. You can see Santa Cruz Church at the end. Because there's a Japanese sniper in the belfry, and he was firing at this side. So they had to knock that out, and they had to aim at the belfry and knock that out, and he actually was knocked out. And after the fires settled down, you have Rizal Avenue looking like this. So Rizal Avenue, which had been one of our pride and joy, now in ruins, largely burned. The fires stopped more or less where Recto is today, because the Americans tried to stop the fire there. They tore down a few houses, so they would create a fire break. And so you look at the other picture that we showed there, that was not touched by the fires. It did not cross the Recto, and it was spared by the fires. But here, you have the fires, the effect of the fires is very clear. This picture tells an interesting story also, because several years ago, I met someone from this platoon, and I was showing him this picture, and when he saw the picture, he almost broke down and cried. He said, "That's my platoon." And he said, "I was not in that picture. I was ahead. I was not taken in the picture because I was one step ahead." But he said, "That's my platoon." And he said, the guy in the middle, smiling, was his best friend. And he showed me, he took out his wallet and showed me. He said, "He's still my best friend today." He died after the fighting, so he did not survive the war. So, the Japanese blew up the bridges. And so this is Santa Cruz Bridge, or MacArthur Bridge, as it was blown. And this is the post office building. Interestingly enough, with the post office building, the Japanese had managed to bring in a number of artillery pieces to the second floor. And if you get into the post office building, it has such a commanding view of Padre Burgos. It's a straight way down that you can block anything in your way. So the post office building had to be fought over and destroyed so that would be knocked down. This is Quezon Bridge. Remember, Quezon Bridge had just been inaugurated in 1940. This is 5 years later. Now it's in the water. And you have the Manila City Hall, also very new, now in ruins, partially in ruins, smoking. Now, what were the strategy and tactics that were used at this point? To the Americans, the major strategy was to isolate the battlefield. They didn't want any of the Japanese to escape from the area, because if they escaped, they would have to fight them out elsewhere. Whether it was in Montalban or elsewhere, they knew they'd have to fight them sooner or later, so they didn't want them to escape. And then they also wanted to secure the basic utilities for the city. That meant the electrical plant, the water resources. Where was the electrical plant in Manila at that time? Not where it is now. The main electric plant of Meralco was in Provisor Island, where they had a big generator. Unfortunately, the Japanese decided to fight for that, and that was a major battleground, and the electric plant was totally destroyed. So you can imagine the rest of the fighting, Manila would not have any light at all. Parts of Manila would also not have water, because the water mains, especially those connected to the bridges, were broken, and so portions of Manila no longer had water. But the Americans realized that the water supplies had to be secured, and so Balara was one of the #1 targets. So it's not very well written about, but one of their first targets was to go to Balara, secure the water filtration plant there, and that involved also taking UP Diliman, which the Japanese had taken over as a camp to protect Balara. The Americans, because the bridges were blown down, now had to cross the Pasig River, and they would try to get the Japanese as much as possible to surrender using psychological warfare. On the Japanese side, the Japanese under Iwabuchi would defend their strong points to the death as long as possible. And they would destroy the port facilities, burn and destroy houses and buildings, and kill unfriendly civilians. The question always was, would they have withdrawn or not? It's still a big question today. Did the Americans make a mistake by encircling Manila and preventing the Japanese from getting out? Knowing that they were there to stay with food for 3 to 6 months, they were not going to leave. And again, remember the Army-Navy rivalry. If the Navy left Manila, that would be a shame for them. So they were not going to give Manila up, and they would stay till the end. Throw into this equation Filipino guerrillas who fought with the Americans, and the civilians were caught in the crossfire. Fighting turned street to street, building to building, and even floor to floor. So, to look at the U.S. Army map, we'd see the American strategy here, encircling Manila to prevent the Japanese from getting out. But there was another reason also for cutting them off. You see the arrows going this way, because they did not want reinforcements to come from the outside. Now, the Americans did not know what the Japanese strategy was, and at one point, in fact, Yamashita would order a counterattack to break into Manila, supposedly to open an avenue of retreat. But to the Americans, that would only mean actually reinforcements coming in, and so they had to block the whole thing. So it was encircled, and the fighting moved slowly inwards. The Americans had Nisei, or second-generation Japanese Americans, who they brought with them to draft the surrender leaflets. If you go outside to the exhibit, you'll see some of those leaflets being displayed. They also had some who were put in front of a microphone and were announcing to the Japanese across the river that to surrender was not loss of face, that you would have to protect the lives, or if they would not want to surrender, at least let the civilians go and resume the fighting after some time. Just leave the civilians out of it. By this time, also, aside from using psychological warfare, the Americans had emplaced some of their artillery pieces. This was in UST. If you go to the UST grounds, this is where the parking lot is now. This was firing towards the Japanese position south of the Pasig. But what had to be done, and this was the painful part of it, was the Americans had to cross the Pasig somehow. And that was where the painful part was. Since the bridges were down, they had to use amphibious vehicles, and they had to cross the Pasig River. This is from the Malacanang side, and they're crossing over into the Malacanang Park area. The Malacanang Park is where the Presidential Security Group is today. but they had to cross to the other side, which was the southern part of the Pasig. And as this picture was taken, actually, you'd see the Japanese firing at the amphibious vehicles crossing the river, and it was a crossing made under fire. And once the Americans had reached the other side, they had to start fighting building to building. This is a classic picture showing the UP campus. This is the Padre Faura area, and notice that there are very few buildings. Today you can hardly see anything there. It's all full of buildings, but that building in the rear there is now the Court of Appeals building. It was the pre-war College of Engineering of UP. And then Padre Faura is on the left side. So you see an American tank, because the fighting was so serious there that you had to use armor to get close because the Japanese were fighting. In fact, there's another picture taken by the same photographer later on with a dead body in the side down there. So this was really close quarters fighting. And in James Scott's book, there's one particular episode there which says that the Americans had gotten into one of the UP buildings in Padre Faura, and they had to fight it out room by room and floor by floor. And in one of those engagements, the Americans decided to spend the night in one building, and they heard the Japanese on the other side, next wall, next room, singing war songs. And then after that, about 2 a.m., they all blew themselves up with grenades. So they would not surrender. Another interesting picture from the fighting. This is in Paco. This is in Paco Market. The market is still there, but again, you can't get this view because it's so full of vendors. It's so crowded today. But this is an interesting picture, and I've always wanted to show this because it shows the Filipino participation in the battle. It was not entirely an American battle by itself. These are Filipino guerrillas fighting in the Paco Market area. You'll see the Filipino in front, close to the camera, not in uniform, just in civilian clothes. He has a gun, he has a modern helmet, but in the distance, to the right, running to the Paco Market, inside it, is another Filipino soldier with the early war helmet there. So again, mixed uniforms, mixed equipment, and there were Japanese inside the building, so this was very dangerous fighting going on. Speaking of the house-to-house fighting, this is another picture that also dramatized house-to-house fighting. Japanese are on the second floor of this house, so how are you going to get in? You have to kick the door in and get in and fight your way through. And as all of that was going on, the Americans would try to use artillery and mortars to try to hit the Japanese on the other side. Of course, the problem with mortar fire and artillery is that they don't choose their targets, and civilians, Japanese soldiers, Marines, anyone who gets hit, gets hit. A friend of mine said that the mortars were scarier than the artillery, because the artillery, you could hear it, and then you would know that it was coming your way, and you could count how far it was away, count the seconds, and it would land. The mortars, no sound. They just land. The mortar shells would just land in front of you and explode. So, as the fighting was going on, the Japanese and the Americans realized that there were several Japanese strong points. The Japanese had determined to make very solid stands in, among others, Provisor Island. That's where the Meralco power plant was. That was totally destroyed. UP Manila, very strongly fortified. The Paco railway station, that's almost gone today, unfortunately. Very important road avenue to the south in getting out of Manila. Manila Police Headquarters. This is now the Manila South Police Headquarters. If you go there today, you'll see it looks like a fortress, and you can imagine how difficult it was to try to reduce that particular position. And then Fort McKinley, or Fort Bonifacio today, where the Japanese had built tunnels, and they had built a lot of underground complexes, some of which are still there today. And then Nichols Field, since that was the important airfield here, it's now Villamor Air Base, or NAIA, that was also very well protected. Then, of course, Intramuros and the government buildings, City Hall, Post Office, and the National Museum buildings today. This is a sketch just after the fighting that shows how some of the positions looked like that the Japanese put up. using sandbags, machine guns behind it. This was in the old ice plant, which no longer exists. This is in the Pasig River side. And then some of the Japanese equipment, or the arms the Japanese were using. One very common field artillery piece was the gun that we see up there. It's a 120 millimeter dual purpose gun. It's a naval gun. It can fire against aircraft, can fire against ships, and can be used for ground use also. This is just outside Intramuros. You see the Manila City Hall right there. There were several of these in the walls of Intramuros, and today there's only one left there. It's kept there as a memorial to the fighting that took place there. The last gun of this type faces Rizal Monument, and it's said that it's still loaded, so if you shake it a little too hard, it might actually detonate. There are several of these still in place, actually. If you go to Camp Aguinaldo, there are two of them in front of General Headquarters. No sign, you think it's ours, you think it's a Revolutionary War gun. No, they're two Japanese guns used in the Battle of Manila. There is one in one of the cemeteries in Manila today also. And a friend's house in San Juan had one in his backyard that was guarding the water supply there. And he was so happy about, look what I have in my backyard. I'm not sure if it's still there anymore, but it was in his backyard for a long time. And the other thing, again, this would show the contrast. You know, a highly developed gun, it's a naval gun. This would come from ships, so they took it ashore. And the other one shows a suicide weapon to be used against tanks. It's a mine attached to a bamboo pole, and you have the soldier running at the tank to detonate it. Of course, this was suicidal, and it was land form of kamikaze. And aside from all of these weapons, the Japanese put up roadblocks. This is a roadblock in Pedro Hill, or Heran, corner Taft Avenue. The building is still there, but you can't get this view anymore because of the LRT. But the streets are still there, and you'll see what they were using as roadblocks: cars, parts of cars, axles, even parts of trains. And they buried mines in the different streets to prevent Americans from getting close. Many of those mines were naval mines. Remember, these were naval troops defending the city. So they had depth charges, and they had bombs that they buried in the ground and made it very dangerous. This is a map of UP at that time. It shows the positions that the Japanese had taken in UP. And again, to fight this area, in this area, you would have to go from one building to another. And remember that picture we had with the tank? There's the College of Engineering building, or the Court of Appeals building. Instead of a tank now, you have soldiers running to William Moore Hall, and you would have, there's another picture taken after this with two soldiers carrying a wounded soldier on a stretcher. So that was how difficult the fighting was going on. And then the picture on the bottom is UP Padre Faura also. The oblation is obscured by smoke. So this was taken from the nurse's home in PGH. So this was what the fighting was like as the Americans moved into the build-up center. Again, within the different buildings and houses, you'd have structures like this, connected by tunnels, individual manned positions, covered by sandbags or with concrete. And in some cases, I think this was in the UP complex, you'd have pillars of concrete and the Japanese hiding behind it, where they could throw a grenade over it. If they'd hear American voices on the other side, they would, as this picture shows, throw a grenade. And these were the ones particularly difficult to subdue. These were concrete pillboxes. None of these exists today. The last ones I know were the ones that were that were closest to Terminal 4 in the airport complex. But they destroyed the last one that I know. So these were very reinforced. They were very strong. They were made of reinforced concrete. They were very difficult to get to because you can imagine a machine gun in each of those windows. And how would you go there? You had to close in very you had to come in very close, throw a grenade or fire into the windows. That was very, very difficult to get to. And as all of this was going on, the Japanese began assembling civilians in some key places and began killing them off. So in the case of LaSalle, there was the LaSalle massacre of February 12, where civilians were brought into LaSalle. It was one of the sturdier buildings in that part of Manila, and they thought they would be safe, but they were killed, and the irony there was they were killed in the chapel of LaSalle. So if you go in the chapel, that is where the killing took place. Rizal Memorial Stadium and close by the Harrison Park, Fort Abad, were also very severely fought after. And this is an aerial photograph taken shortly after the fighting. You see LaSalle there. And you see that there's almost nothing else aside from that. You'd see the owners of this house and this would be very fortunate because these were spared. But you'd see LaSalle and around it, the Rizal complex is over in the upper right. That's the Rizal Sports Complex there. But much of it was destroyed, partly because of fires, partly because of American shelling. And this is what LaSalle looked like just after the war. Still standing, but some damage, and by this time, the victims had been killed in the chapel area. Another picture of LaSalle. Well, since this was an original lecture I gave in LaSalle, I put a little more pictures of LaSalle here. But we've also represented UP pretty well. Now, again, to show how serious this fighting was, the defenses in the Vito Cruz, Taft area. This is just one intersection and shows all the mines that the Japanese put right in the streets. And these were covered by machine guns, and these had aerial bombs, barbed wire, and other items put there. Another picture of the fighting then was, this is Vito Cruz. Santa Scholastica is on the left side, still like that today. On the right side, you'd see civilians sheltering from Japanese fire further down the road. These pillars where the light is are still there today. Fighting took place in Rizal Memorial Stadium. The Americans would later say in their documentaries that there was no ball game at this particular time. Instead of playing ball, they were fighting in the bleachers. And also in the Rizal Park Complex, Rizal Memorial Complex, is this picture showing again how close the fighting was. They had to break a hole in, bring in this bazooka, and try to hit the Japanese on the other side. Another picture of the Rizal Complex. And then from there, they would now move into the inner areas of Manila and finally go into Intramuros. And this was a map of the fighting in Intramuros where the Japanese were. And since the Americans could not enter Intramuros as it was then, they had to break the walls open. And to break the walls open, they had to use heavy artillery, which was, if you're in Manila today, you would be in the City Hall side of things, you'd be in the Metropolitan Theater, and you would be having the guns pointing directly at the walls of Intramuros because there was no other way to get into Intramuros except to destroy the walls, crush them, create a place where the soldiers would climb in, and they climbed through there. The other way to Intramuros was to cross the Pasig River, and they had to do this also coming from the Binondo side. And as they landed in the pass on the Intramuros side, they would meet civilians. Most of the civilians would be women and children because the men had been killed in Fort Santiago. Interesting picture this because we wonder what happened to the guy who's in the back. He's losing his balance, obviously, so he probably fell after that. After the fighting, again, the Americans made a map of the defenses, Japanese defenses in Intramuros, and this would just show how strongly defended it was. This also shows a tunnel complex under the Manila Cathedral going to San Agustin Church and so forth. Some of those may have been built by the Japanese, some of them may have been built by the Spaniards even before. I was told that there were even more tunnels that they found only recently. And again, the fighting in Intramuros would be so severe that they would have to use flamethrowers to kill the Japanese who were there. And again, serious enough to use tanks. This is in the Santo Domingo Church area. You remember the Santo Domingo Church in 1941 burning. This is all that's left of it in 1945, and the tanks going through. And more pictures of the ruins in Intramuros. That's why when you go to Intramuros today, there's very little that is original there. Most of it was destroyed. And again, since most of the men folk had been killed, it was the women who had to be saved from there. Very classic picture, also from the war, in M4 Sherman tank entering Fort Santiago. And from Intramuros, the fighting would move across to the Legislative Building, the Congress Building, here from the walls of Intramuros, looking at the Congress Building. And all throughout that time, you would have the big massacres also taking place. At the German club, the Spanish consulate, it didn't matter whether they were Americans or Japanese, or rather, the nationality didn't matter as long as they were perceived as dangerous. One German in the German club would actually come out of the German club and wave his passport, which had a swastika in it, to say, "I am German," and Germany and Japan were allies at the time. He was shot and killed right there. Others who were in the shelter of the German club would try to send children out, thinking that the Japanese would respect the children. They knew that the Japanese had soft spot for children, but the children were killed nonetheless. And the German club was burned. Spanish consulate, the Masonic Temple, La Salle, Concordia College, Singalong area, the Red Cross building, where the Japanese went from one room to another and went from one toilet booth to another, bayoneting nurses and doctors, St. Paul College and others, and caught in the crossfire houses and places in Ermita and Malate. So we won't go into too much detail there, but these are some of the images that we have of those who died. See, there's a dead child, dead baby actually there. These are priests in San Agustin Church, who were discovered after the battle finished. And for those who survived, no more ambulances, so the only ambulance possible was pushcart. There's a better picture of this outside. And as the refugees began to flee out of the fighting areas, remember that the bridges had been blown and there was no way to cross the Pasig River. So the Americans had to put up a temporary bridge. It was called a pontoon bridge, a floating bridge put up on rubber rafts. And the first refugees began to cross on this makeshift bridge, the pontoon bridge. What you see in the background here is the old National Development Company compound. These are warehouses, these are factories. Today, this is the area of PUP in Santa Mesa. So this was the temporary bridge that they put up. And the civilians here, survivors of the battle, are bringing whatever they could with them. Another picture also of the same bridge, showing the civilians waiting to cross the river and get out to the safer side. One area that was not particularly badly hit was Santa Ana, because the Japanese had not fully developed that area. There was a bridge leading to that place, and the refugees went down Pedro Hill and went down into Santa Ana. And fortunately for them, the people in Santa Ana took care of them and tried to give them food and medicine as best they could. The end of the battle was 1 month. The whole battle took place 1 month. It started in February 3, it ended on March 3, 1945. Before that, the Philippine Commonwealth government would be reinstated in Malacanang. President Quezon was brought back, and in a very moving ceremony in Malacanang on February 27, MacArthur turned over the reins of government to President Osmeña. It's said that at one point he wiped a tear from his eye. I'm not sure if that's actually true. There's no recording of the speech actually, but I've seen pictures of him in the ceremony. And then, one thing that is not very well known is that since many of those who had been killed, or the structures that had been destroyed, involved Spanish materials. Many of the churches were still Spanish, and Spain had remained neutral at this time. Spain began to ask Duque what's happening in Manila, by radio, by telegram. What is happening to Manila? We hear that Spaniards are being killed. We hear that our churches are being destroyed. And the Spanish Foreign Ministry was unable to answer satisfactorily. So on April 12, 1945, Spain broke relations officially with Japan. Spain did not go the next step further by declaring war. She was not in a position to declare war at that time. But she did break relations with Japan. With the end of the battle, you now have the American flag being restored to what was then the American High Commissioner's residence. It was not yet the American Embassy. Today, this is part of the U.S. Embassy. The flagpole is still the same. You still see the bullet holes in the flagpole from 1945. In the background, you will see the Army-Navy Club. Last March 3, they reenacted this. I think the ambassador was there and some other VIPs raised the flag again 75 years later. This was the ceremony in Malacanang, where MacArthur turned over the reins of government, whatever was left of that anyway, to Osmeña. And fortunately, Malacanang was spared the fighting and remained intact. But the rest of Manila, particularly south of that, was destroyed. This is an aerial photograph showing closest area here is Santa Cruz and Binondo, totally destroyed by Japanese fire. And then Intramuros destroyed. We have the post office, the theater. And another view of the same area. This is Bilibid Prison. Only half of this remains. It used to be a full circle, but only half of this remains today. You'll notice also that Quezon Bridge is still down, Jones Bridge is down as well, and the Intramuros area is smoking. And as the war ended, many American camps were put in the places where the fighting took place. This is the Rizal Stadium. You see many tents put up there because after the battle for Manila was the rest of the fighting for the Philippines that included Baguio, northern Luzon, and so forth. And after the Philippines, Japan was the next target. And so all the American supplies were being brought into the Philippines even as the Battle of Manila ended. So as the Battle for Manila ended, the cost was 16,000 Japanese killed, almost all Japanese Navy men, Marines, some Army people, some Japanese civilians who were forced to join the Japanese. Not all of them have been identified. There were a few Taiwanese who were part of this actually. I mean, look at 16,000. This is about one division. This is a division number. There were 1,010 Americans killed during that 1 month of fighting, but there were tens of thousands who were injured. And when you talk about those who can fight, you don't just count the number of people who were killed, but also those who were injured and who could no longer fight. So the other thing that is not told in these statistics is how many were injured and could no longer be fought and had to be brought to hospitals throughout. So they could no longer be used to fight future battles. And the divisions that fought here were severely depleted because of the numbers of men not only killed, but also wounded. And then in the fighting for Manila itself, about 100,000 civilians were killed, including Spaniards, Germans, one Venezuelan, few Russians, and others. So the lone Venezuelan is interesting also because we didn't have formal relations with Venezuela yet at that time. There was a consul here, but diplomatic relations were not particularly strong. And the lone Venezuelan in Manila was killed, bayoneted to death. And several years ago, the Venezuelan embassy called me up at UP and asked, can you give us more light on how our consul was killed? So I turned over whatever stuff I had to them. But there are all these other stories because the Germans, of course, they had their own stories as well. And each of the Filipinos who was killed would have their stories too. 100,000 is perhaps a conservative estimate because these are people that could be identified. What about those who could not be identified? And for those, of course, who lived in the richer houses would not even know the full names of their maids or drivers or others. They simply vanished. And millions of pesos worth of infrastructure, historical, and cultural materials. The National Library was totally destroyed. The books that were in the Congress building were totally destroyed. The UP Library was also totally destroyed. There was nothing left of it. Just to compare, the pre-war picture of the Legislative Building or the National Library and the post-war picture of the same building. So none of the books survived the fires and the destruction. In the case of UP, it's an interesting thing because we know that some students are careless in returning books, and when the war started, some students were unable to return their books on time. And so imagine that by 1945, in 3 years, what would the fines be? Overdue book, how much would you pay? So fortunately, the UP waived those fines because they said these are the only books we have left from the library. And so anyone who can return them, please return them. And so that became the basis of the post-war UP library. People who who held their books and did not return them in time. So perhaps there's some logic to that. One person that I did get to know was unable to return a book she borrowed from the National Library, because one could borrow books from the National Library at that time. But she was interned in Santo Tomas for 3 years, and afterwards was taken back to the United States. And about 10 years ago, she came back here with the book and said, I want to return this to the National Library. And the National Library was perplexed. They had no idea, what do we do with this? How do we deal with this particular case? And I think eventually they solved things, and she returned the book. Another person who lost his whole collection was MacArthur. MacArthur, of course, lived in the Manila Hotel, the penthouse of the Manila Hotel. His private library was there. And at least the Japanese commanders in Manila were conscious of the fact that it was an important library. So they didn't take it apart. But it was destroyed in the Battle for Manila. And this shows MacArthur going through the ruins of his penthouse, 1945, nothing left. One can imagine what emotions he had at this time. All of his memorabilia was now up in smoke and in ashes. The Manila Cathedral was in ruins. This is what we had. And this picture tells another story too, because on the right side of the picture, the Palacio del Gobernador, that's where a big massacre took place also. There was an air raid shelter and civilians were killed there. After all the fighting, after all the shooting was over, then it was time to clean up. It was time to bury the dead. It was time to clean the streets. And this is a picture taken in Intramuros. And you have a bulldozer starting to clear the streets. It's an interesting bulldozer because it's an armored bulldozer. If you look closely at it, it's not open. It is shielded with armor because it was known that the Japanese were shooting at the bulldozer drivers too. And so this is an armored bulldozer. And in the end, the dead had to be buried. Many of them were never identified. This is a temporary cemetery just outside Letran. You can go to this exact location. We're not sure if any of the bones were actually left here, but there were many, many cemeteries that were made, that were dug just to put the remains of the dead. The Filipino dead, the American dead, they were buried. Many of the Japanese were not buried and were left out in the streets to rot. And since this was now coming into March, 75 years ago, you can imagine the stench. There are pictures of civilians walking past dead Japanese bodies, covering their noses and so forth. It became a health nightmare because of all the germs and all of the dust that was coming in, and all it was so unsanitary that at one point the Americans decided to spray the whole of Manila with DDT, an insecticide. Today it's a dangerous chemical now. We wouldn't do it anymore. But they sent 3 planes to cover the whole Manila and spray the whole area with DDT to kill all those germs. maybe if the virus continues on today, maybe they might think of doing that again as they did 75 years ago. But anyway, let me end my presentation here. It's gone too long. So again, these cemeteries were all over the place, and still to this day, there are people who have not been recovered. There are people who have simply disappeared from the face of the earth. Many of the ruins have been cleaned up. Many of the ruins many of the ruined buildings have been rebuilt, but the memories are still there. And if you know where to look, you'll still be able to find pockmarks, shell holes, and perhaps even live shells, which you should not touch. So with that, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Jose. Now we'll open to questions. Mr. Ligarda.
Rico, two things. Number one, just two things. Number one, the declaration of Laurel was not the declaration of the state of war, but the declaration of the existence of the state of war. Number two, not all the books in the National Library were lost, because I understand that the employees were able to transfer some of them to the normal school,
Yes.
which was not defended and which was intact.
Yes. Okay, yeah, so that is true. There were attempts, actually, since some people knew that fighting was going to take place, there were attempts to move some of the books in the National Library. And to this day, I don't know why the Japanese did not defend normal college, normal university today. I've seen post-war pictures; it's still fairly intact. But that was it was a strong building, and they didn't. They did defend another school next to it, and of course Concordia College was a couple of blocks from there. But yes, there were some of the books that were saved, and also another bunch of material that was saved were some of the relics of the National Museum were saved by Otley Bayer. Bayer had close contacts with a Japanese anthropologist. They both spoke the same language, and so Bayer was actually never put in Santo Tomas. So he was allowed out to continue field studies and discussing with this Japanese anthropologist. So some of his materials, some of his archaeological material was saved, and in fact the Japanese asked him to move it out, and he did move it out. So that's true. And then the first point that you made, the declaration of state of war, yes. Laurel did not actually outrightly declare a state of war, but he declared the existence of a state of war, which is quite different from declaring war. And after he declared the existence of state of war, the next thing he said was, there will be no conscription in the Philippines. So what's a war with no conscription? So the Japanese were so baffled by that, they were outmaneuvered by Laurel, that a few months later they created the Makapili, which served as their kind of private army with Filipinos, totally separate from the Philippine government.
Okay, I would like to inquire about the actual process of getting during the American coastline landings in late and prior to Paco Market, where was he during that time?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so the question is, where was Yamashita during the actual Battle for Manila? Well, okay, Yamashita arrived in the Philippines early October 1944. In fact, when he arrived, Manila was already being attacked by American planes. So he arrived at a time when Manila was already at war. His location was in Fort McKinley, or Fort Bonifacio today. There's an underground tunnel there. It is the Bonifacio complex is thinking of converting it into a museum, but he had his headquarters. It was the pre-war U.S. Commanding General's quarters. The building is not there anymore, but the tunnel network is still there. So he was there October 44, November 44, he was there. So he was directing the battle for Leyte from Metro Manila. Just to show how little the Japanese knew about Philippine conditions, Yamashita did not know anything about the Philippines when he arrived, so he had to study very quickly, crash course on what the Philippines was like. And his chief of staff arrived a few days after he arrived, when Leyte had already been invaded. So you see how late the preparations are. The top people in the Japanese military system are arriving just as the fighting is beginning. Admiral Iwabuchi arrived in November 1944, so very, very late. And in fact, General Yamashita's chief of staff, General Muto, would even, when he was told the news, Leyte has just been invaded, Muto said, very interesting, but where is Leyte? He had no idea where it was, so it was shown the map, and he was pointed, this is where it is. So where was Yamashita during the actual fighting? By December, he had ordered his troops to move out of Manila, at least the army troops, and they had moved to Baguio. The guerrillas were reporting this. They moved to Baguio, they moved to the Zambales area, they were moving into the mountains. Yamashita himself moved into where Ipo Dam is today. He was there in January 1945. And then during the height of the battle, he had moved to Baguio. So some of the people who defend him would actually say he was out of touch with what was happening in Manila. But his next in command in this area was General Yokoyama, who was in charge of the army area that included Manila. And Yokoyama and Yamashita were in constant radio communication with each other. And Yokoyama was in radio communication with Admiral Iwabuchi in Manila. So Yamashita would have known what was going on here. Plus the fact that Yamashita was receiving news from Tokyo. The Japanese ambassador to the Philippines at that time, Ambassador Murata, was also in Baguio at that time, and they were exchanging notes. And they were receiving diplomatic notes from Tokyo. And among those diplomatic notes were these complaints by the Spaniards. What's going on in Manila? Why are you killing Spaniards? So Yamashita knew about that. Now, he's supposed to have given Yokoyama orders to tell Iwabuchi to get out. And at one point, Iwabuchi would move from the Intramuros area, the government building complex, to Fort Bonifacio, the same tunnel that we were talking about. And he would decide not to get out, go back in, and stay in Manila till he committed suicide. His body was never found. So Yamashita was in Baguio at that time. Baguio was being bombed by American planes also at the same time. But to say that he didn't know what was going on here is not true. He would have known.
In fact, Rico, Yamashita was asked by Governor Ginto to declare Manila an open city, and he refused.
Yes.
In other words, he was really intending to fight.
Okay, yes. Not only Mayor Ginto was asking Yamashita to declare Manila an open city, even Laurel. Laurel would personally intercede several times. Please declare Manila an open city, just as we did it, as was done in December 1941. Yamashita's excuse was, I don't have the authority to do that. It is Tokyo that has to do that. I cannot, I'm the field commander. So whether he was telling the truth or not, we don't know. But he was passing the buck, and so he was passing it on to Tokyo. Tokyo, of course, wouldn't have known what to do. But Ginto and Laurel did intercede for Manila several times.
We are familiar. Good afternoon. We are familiar with we have this Villamor Air Base in Cavite.
Yes.
You have mentioned, Doc, some of the strategies of the Americans as well as the strategies of the Japanese in the Second World War, but little is mentioned about the strategies of the Filipinos.
Yeah.
Now, in connection to this, since we have this Villamor Air Base in Cavite, can you give us some information, whether personal, professional, about Sergeant Villamor? Who was this person in the Second World War? What was he?
Yeah.
And what were the spaces and places of Sergeant Villamor in the Second World War?
Okay, well, is that Villamor, who is Villamor Airfield in, it's not in Cavite, but it's Pasay.
In Pasay. Yes, sorry.
So today it's called Villamor Air Base. That's the Air Force part of it, but that's the NAIA complex, Ninoy Aquino International Airport Complex. Villamor was not a private, he was not a sergeant, he was an officer in the Philippine Army Air Corps. So one of the very few who studied aviation in the United States. He was a very good pilot, he was a fighter pilot. He was in command of the 6th Pursuit Squadron when the war broke out. He was initially based in Batangas in the Lipa Air Base complex. And then during the war, the early part of the war, he was actually in where Camp Aguinaldo is now. There was an airfield there called Zablan Field, and that's where his planes were. So he was a hero because apart from commanding that fighter squadron, when the Japanese bombed the airfield in Zablan Field, that was around December 10 or December 12, he took his planes up into the air. They were outmoded planes, they were about 10 years old, they were very slow, they were very old, and he was facing modern Japanese aircraft that were flying almost twice as fast as his planes, and he is supposed to have shot down 1 or 2 planes. So it was almost suicidal, and because of that, he was awarded a medal by MacArthur personally, I think the Distinguished Service Cross, which is next to the Medal of Honor. So he was awarded even before the Bataan fighting. He was already recognized as a hero then. And when Bataan was being fought, he did another heroic act by flying an even more outmoded plane, a biplane, a twin two-plane reconnaissance plane, to fly over Cavite and take pictures of the Japanese positions there. That was suicidal because you were attracting the Japanese planes to attack you, and you are flying only 100 miles an hour, and they were flying 300 miles an hour. And very weak plane, very little ammunition. There were American planes that protected him, but he did take those pictures, which allowed Corregidor to fire on the Japanese positions there and destroy those Japanese positions in Cavite. And the third thing that he did, which also makes him a hero, was after Bataan fell, he was evacuated and he eventually wound up in Australia. But in Australia, he volunteered to come back to the Philippines. So he was sent back to the Philippines on a submarine in 1943 and told to organize the guerrilla forces in the Visayas area. He landed in Negros and tried to organize the guerrillas in Negros and Iloilo, Panay, and all the way reaching up to Manila. So that was very dangerous work. He organized a spy system which continued to function all the way till the end of the war. Unfortunately, there were issues between him and MacArthur, some of which are too complex to mention here, but he eventually was called back to Australia, was awarded another medal, was recognized by Quezon. But the tragedy was that after that, it seems he suffered discrimination from people up there. He was once given command of the Civil Aviation Authority, CAA, but he couldn't function very well there. And he eventually wound up going to the United States to teach in a university there. He died in the States in the 70s. He was brought back to the Philippines after he died, and the field was named after him when he was brought back in the 70s. So he was an aviation hero, he was a guerrilla hero, he was a symbol of Philippine resistance in the air and on the ground.
A few weeks ago, one of the more exciting news is the discovery of the grave with the marker of Maria Rosa.
Yes.
So just like to know more like how were the women and the children coping and fighting through?
Okay, yeah. So very interesting question. We have not really tackled the women so much here, but there were many heroic women in the Philippines at that time, and even in the Battle for Manila. Maria Y. Orosa was important for several reasons. One was she was a food technologist, one of the very few that we had before the war. She was going into recipes that were good and healthy for Filipinos without resorting to imported materials. She invented what was called the palayok oven, the palayok stove, using local materials so you could bake bread in that without using an oven. She also came up with the first recipe for banana ketchup, but it was someone else who circulated that during the war. But she was a very prominent scientist in the sense of food technology. During the war, she was extremely concerned about the health of her compatriots, that she did try to come up with new recipes which were healthy enough but cheap enough and using local materials. Unfortunately, she was killed in the Battle for Manila. So I'm not sure whether she was struck by an American shell or whether she was killed in the fighting. I don't know the exact details, but her body was never found. That's why a few weeks ago when they did come up with a tombstone with her name in it, that was very, very exciting news. But it seems the family was not convinced. And so the news was played down. If you look at your 1,000 peso bill, if you have a 1,000 peso bill with you, you'll notice that there are three faces in them. One of them is Jose Abad Santos, who represented the government sector at that time. Jose Abad Santos never collaborated with the Japanese. He chose to die rather than work with the Japanese. His body was never found. The other one that we have there is General Vicente Lim, who represented the military sector, commanded the 41st Division in Bataan, tried to establish a guerrilla group in Manila, was captured by the Japanese on the way to Mindoro and executed, never found also, unknown, missing. And the third person, if we go back to the women issue, is Josefa Llanes Escoda. And Josefa Llanes Escoda, of course, founded the Girl Scouts of the Philippines, was a civic worker. During the Japanese occupation, she was very concerned about feeding prisoners of war, feeding the internees in Santo Tomas. She was working to get food to the prisoners of war and to the internees in Santo Tomas. And she was also, because she was a civic worker, trying to elevate the conditions of people that she could. So she did have an organization, the Federation of Women Clubs, National Federation of Women Clubs in the Philippines, which still exists today. So she is their kind of supreme leader or something. So their building is named after her. She also did not survive the war. So how she died exactly, we don't know the details, and she has also not been found. So when you look at that 1,000 peso bill, you are looking at three Filipinos who sacrificed their lives from different sectors of society, none of who was found. There are many others. Some were active in the guerrillas. We mentioned Yay Marking, Yay Panlilio Marking, who led the Marking's guerrillas in their military operations. You had Fed Del Mundo, doctor, who worked to try to get a children's hospital for the Santo Tomas children, the children interned in Santo Tomas. These were women who were really working extremely hard, and we're just talking in the Metro Manila area. Outside Metro Manila, there were many, many more women that I can give names, but let's just concentrate on the Manila area. So these are just some examples, and there are, of course, a lot more. Remember in the picture, the nurse is pushing the cart.
Next question.
Which one?
Professor, I think the Battle of Manila is a very important event in Philippine history, and there's still a lot to study, and from the American point of view, Filipino point of view. But I think, like all stories, if you really truly want to understand what happened, and this may not be the most popular question, but I think we need to understand from the Japanese point of view. And I'm not asking the question to lessen what they did, but to understand what happened. The reason I asked so is I'm reading this book that's just come out about the U.S. ambassador to Tokyo, Thomas Grew. I think I recommend it be read. It's called Into the Cauldron. It's very interesting because we have this view that the Japanese government entered into the war wholeheartedly, and it doesn't seem to be the case. There was a lot of resistance to the war, etc., etc. The emperor didn't seem to want it. So I think story also has to come out to round off the whole thing.
Yeah, definitely. The Japanese side of the picture has to be brought out. And perhaps the Battle of Manila is not the best place to talk about it because very few Japanese survived. There were only less than, I think there were only about 20 or 30 who were captured in the fighting. I have looked at the interrogation reports, and some of them were really, they didn't want to say anything. But some of the interrogation reports are very telling because, yes, many of them were professional Navy people. One of them had actually participated in the raid and subsequent massacre in Shanghai in 1937. One other one had seen the rape of Nanjing. And so some of these people had actually seen massacres taking place in China. But to do it on a bigger scale is very hard because if you have only 20, a source sample of 20, you can't generalize. These are just 20 people who managed to be captured and told only fragments of their story. Some of them were survivors of shipwrecks. They knew nothing about the Philippines, and therefore they would be very antagonistic towards anybody who attacked them, and they could not differentiate whether Spanish or German or American or Filipino. They were all enemies. And so when you get to that point, you cease to think in terms of rational thought. And if we look at another incident or another officer in the Batangas Laguna area, there was a Japanese army officer, Colonel Fujishige, in command of the garrison in Batangas and Laguna. And the guerrilla resistance movement was so strong there that by 1945 he was telling his men, destroy this town, exterminate the people, and so forth. We can understand that because his men were being killed right and left, and he was responsible to them. But it got to the point that I guess he got paranoid, and his men, his junior officers, were in fact telling him, we cannot kill all these men. Are you going to say women and children together with the men, suspected or not? He said, just kill them all. I will take responsibility. Well, they did. They killed Taal, Batangas. So when Taal volcano erupted last January and they were mentioning the towns, they said, these are the towns where the massacres took place. Precisely. Lipa, Tanawan, Bawan, and then in Laguna, Los Baños, Calamba, all these places, all done under the command of this one guy. And the junior officers, you read the transcripts of the trial, they were telling him, we cannot do this. And he told them, I will take full responsibility. Leave it to me. Well, he was captured when the war ended. And when he began to talk, he said, my men did it on their own. I could not control them. So when it came up to a full-blown war crimes trial, his men said, he told us to do it, and he would take responsibility. So the truth came up. He was executed for that. Iwabuchi, of course, escaped that. He killed himself in the agriculture building. But again, what we have are fragments. Some of those who actually fought in the Battle of Manila were civilians who had very little military training. They had been local residents of Manila who were drafted. Some of them survived, told their stories, said we didn't know what to do, we were caught in this maelstrom. There were a number who were Taiwanese, and their story only began to come out about 10 years ago when a documentary was made about the defense of Manila. So there's a lot. Now what we do know about the fighting is the orders that survived. And it talks about when you kill people, put them in one house and burn the house so we save bullets and all of that. And concentrate them all so we don't have to do too much work. And you have field diaries saying, I killed 1,000 people today. But again, that scratches the surface. What were their real thoughts? And we'll probably never get to that point. But again, to look at the other side is very important. And there are a few instances of Japanese who showed humanitarian concern during the fight. I think it was in the Paco area, before the fires were set up, one Japanese couldn't communicate with the Filipinos, but he took out a rosary and said, I am Christian like you, and I don't want what's happening. And in the case of La Salle, when people were starting to move into the building because it was the only solid building there, another Japanese in the area was saying, don't go to Lasal because something bad is going to happen there. Move somewhere else. So there are these other cases of Japanese who probably had pangs of conscience, and there were orders there, but they had to do something about it. And one extremely personal case is one Japanese who had arrived in the Philippines in 1922, and he worked in Zamboanga for a while, came to Manila in the 30s. He had become so close to the Filipino population in Manila that he was well loved, Mr. Osawa Kiyoshi. And when the Japanese army was moving up to Baguio, the mountain province, a truck ran over him, a Japanese truck ran over him. His legs were broken. He was rushed to Philippine General Hospital. And he was looked upon, or he was treated by none other than the director of the Philippine General Hospital, Dr. Antonio Sison, who he did not tell anybody there's a Japanese in this hospital, because he knew that if anyone knew, they would immediately kill him. But he protected him, and the nurses protected him. And after the war, he continued to stay in the Philippines. He stayed here until the 1990s, and he died here. And I had the good fortune of knowing him quite well. And in one lecture that we invited him to, he invited the nurse who took care of him. So when he told his story, people were saying, I can't believe this, it's too improbable. And he said, I want to thank my nurse. And she stood up, and I took care of him in PGH. So there are these personal vignettes. But again, we'll never get to see the whole picture. So we can only try to get bits and pieces and try to see that. It's a very complex issue.
Yeah.
Okay, one
Uh,
more.
So before that, I just like to say you do not do interjections of the vernacular like most speakers do. You have a neutral accent like that of the East Coast, you know, like that. First of the three, I just would like to know why the Santa Ana, Manila area was touched by the Japanese. Number two, is that the General Yamashita of the Yamashita gold in the treasure that Mike was saying about? And number three, I was told that most of the Japanese who were bayoneting and killing were not Japanese, they were Koreans.
Okay.
Are you knowledgeable on that?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Two of those three questions are questions I'm asked at almost all the lectures I give. But on the first question, why was Santa Ana spared? I think Santa Ana was outside the immediate defense perimeter of the Japanese. They went up to Paco, but they would not cross into the... Santa Ana was a bit outside their area of responsibility. Remember, they only had 16,000 men, and they concentrated them in very limited areas. You could not disperse them. If you look at it also, you say very few men were put in Quezon City. There was there was some fighting in New Manila. There were among some of the buildings, some of the houses there, but not in the same scale as downtown Manila. Balara, there was a firefight, but not too much. So they could not put people everywhere. So I think they left Santa Ana out, which was fortunate for the people in Santa Ana. Second question was about Yamashita. All right, there is the well circulated story of Yamashita treasure, and people are continuing to look for it today and so forth. My take on that is, first, Yamashita could not have had any treasure with him at that time. When did Yamashita arrive? October 44. Manila was already being bombed. He was in Manchuria for 2.5 years. And then all of a sudden, he was told, go to Tokyo, receive your orders, fly out to the Philippines. He only had time in Tokyo, 2 nights in Tokyo. He saw his superiors, saw his wife, and said, I'm going somewhere else, and he never came back. So he was in no position to bring any treasure here. So one would say, would it then have been the other Japanese commanders who brought the treasure in? Well, the stories are that the treasure came from mainland Southeast Asia, that it came from Singapore and elsewhere. But those stories are very difficult to believe. Why? We had our own gold here. There were gold mines in Benguet, there were gold mines elsewhere. And the Japanese did not need gold for their war industries. They needed copper, they needed manganese, they had other resources. And so the mining equipment in Benguet was actually removed and transferred to copper mines, which they needed more. If they wanted gold, it was there for them to take. Why bring it from outside? Also, why leave it here in the first place when the Japanese knew that this would be a front line sooner or later? They could have taken it to Korea, which was their colony. They could have brought it to Taiwan, safer there. And in fact, when the war ended, the day the war stopped, the day the fighting stopped, Japanese were moving treasures from China to Tokyo by airplane. So why bring it here in the first place? Now, okay, there was some treasure here. The Japanese looted the banks, they looted houses, they looted anything that they could get. We talked to people in Death March, everything that they had, watches and everything was looted, the banks were looted. So one finds caches of silver coins in La Union, one finds other precious metals here and there. The gold, the best analysis or the best explanation I have for that is a Japanese friend of mine who worked with the Ministry of Finance and was assigned here during the war, was here for 2.5 years. He was in Manila for 2 years, then he was sent to the Legazpi for the last year or so. He was in the Ministry of Finance and he had heard all these stories about the gold. And so I met him and he talked to me about what he thought. He had published an article, and his explanation is that the Japanese sent gold here because the Mickey Mouse money was useless. With the Mickey Mouse money, they could not buy anything. They were up in the mountains, they were up in the jungles. The people would not take it. So their solution was to bring in gold coins, either from China or from Taiwan, I forget. At least 2 shiploads made it to northern Luzon, whether that was Apari or Livigan, I'm not sure, or Lawag, I'm not sure. But it did get to northern Luzon, and the soldiers and officers were paid in those gold coins. And they in turn bought food from the Igorots there. And that gold coin is one of the rarest coins in the world today. This friend of mine collects coins, and he said, that is one coin I know exists, but I never saw it. And just before I left Japan, after I finished my studies, he called me up. I found one. And so he invited me to his house, and he showed me this is the coin.
How much it's supposed to be worth already?
I don't know how much it's. I wouldn't know how much it would be priceless at this point because it's extremely rare. And so he was so excited. He showed it to me. This is the coin. And I actually got to talk to some Japanese who did say yes, we were paid in gold coins in northern Luzon. So so people would have heard about it, and probably so that they could not be traced, they melted it into gold ingots and can't find the coin anymore. The last question regarding whether it was other people who committed the atrocities. I had heard those stories many times, so I started interviewing people in the 70s, and they said, oh, the Koreans were the ones who were more brutal. Some of them were saying, yeah, so look at the way the Koreans behave today, it's rough. But when I went to Japan the first time, my Japanese friends said, that's not true. Because they said, oh, you can be forgiven for that. And they said, where did you learn that? That's not true. And since that time, I've looked into the units that came here. There were 2 Japanese divisions that came to the Philippines from Korea. One of them went straight to Mindanao, fought in the Davao area. And the other one arrived in La Union late 1944. Went into the mountains right away. But I looked into the records of those 2 divisions, and it said these were divisions mobilized in Korea, but majority of the men were Japanese.
Really?
And so only a fraction of them were Koreans. And a few years ago, I bought a book which I think is the decisive study of Koreans in Japanese military service. And it said that the mobilization of Koreans in the Japanese army did not start until 1943. They were afraid that if they armed them, they would turn against the Japanese. And so they, unlike the Americans who created, let's say, the Philippine Scouts in the Phil-American War, the Japanese never created an all-Korean unit. They were afraid. they mixed the Koreans with other Japanese. And when you look at the track record, when you look at the interrogations of prisoners of war, more Taiwanese were captured than there were Koreans. And the Korean, seems like there's very little, they were here as labor troops, but not as combatant troops until very, very late, and very small numbers.
We are so bad at Japanese.
Okay, we'll entertain just two more questions because it's getting rather late. This gentleman and Mr.
Yeah, my question is, were there organized Filipino guerrilla units that were involved in the fighting in the Battle of Manila? What was their role? And then the bigger question is, how big was the contribution of the Filipino guerrilla forces to the eventual liberation of the Philippines? Sometimes it's said that the Americans came in October 1944. The Filipino guerrillas have been fighting for 2.5 years or more, and that the war had been largely won by them, and that the Americans came to mop up. Your comments, please.
Okay. First item, what guerrilla units were here? There were several guerrilla units in the Metro Manila area. One problem with the guerrilla units in Metro Manila area was that they never fully were united. Unlike, let's say, in Cebu or in Iloilo, in Panay, where eventually they were united under certain commanders. The fact that this is an urban area and you have to protect yourself from spies and all of that meant that you had to operate in small groups. And so we have, for example, the Hunters ROTC guerrilla unit, which was composed essentially of college students, that's why it's ROTC, teenagers. You have the Marquings guerrillas who operated from Laguna and up into Manila. You had the Huachi guerrillas who were in Binondo, the Chinese guerrillas. They were very instrumental in securing the Binondo area after most of it was burned already. So there were various, Manuel Colaico, who led the 1st Cavalry to UST, belonged to another guerrilla group. So there were many guerrilla groups, and the unfortunate thing is that it seems many of the American forces were kind of reluctant to rely on their intelligence. Of course, they gave a lot of very good intelligence, but there was some intelligence that was really way off the mark. So if you're a field commander and you're receiving tons of intelligence, what are you going to believe? Some officers believed in them, so it's very good that they did so. Others brushed them away. So when you looked at the participation of the guerrillas in the liberation campaign, some of them played very strong roles. In Leyte, they did play very strong roles. In Mindanao, they did play very strong roles. But the thing about the guerrillas was that the guerrillas were basically a hit-and-run organization. They were good for ambushes, they were good for raids, they were good for small-scale operations. They were not organized in division level, they were not even organized in regimental level except on skeletal groups. And they did not have field arms. They had rifles, they had machine guns. Later, some of them had bazookas, but they had no artillery. They had no armored warfare, no tanks, nothing, no armored cars. And so to say that we had won the war before the Americans arrived would be exaggerating. The Americans, when they came back, the Japanese did have the Air Force and everything, and we had no Air Force. So we had to rely on the U.S. Air Force, we had to rely on the U.S. Navy, otherwise we couldn't have won the war. So it was, I think, to me, it's a combination of both. We helped a great deal, but we couldn't have won it on our own.
Okay, we'll take the last question from Mr. Montilla.
Can you explain De Vera's role during the Japanese period?
Which De Vera?
Of the Vera Reyes and so forth.
Okay, yeah. The Vera Reyes, Okay, Vera Reyes is a very controversial person. He was a double agent during the war. What was his first name? Vera Reyes was supposedly an intelligence agent on the guerrilla side. He was able to win over many guerrillas from different groups, Ramses guerrillas, he approached the Hunters, ROTC people, and others. What were his credentials? He showed them late issues or recent issues of Time magazine or Life magazine, which came by submarine. He would show them matchbooks with MacArthur's I Shall Return, his profile. so the matchbooks and other propaganda material. So the guerrillas were convinced this guy was a real agent of the Americans. It turns out he was working for the Japanese. And so they turned over the rosters, they turned over a lot of materials, and before they knew it, the people in the rosters were being arrested. And they were never seen again. They were brought to Fort Santiago, they were punished by the Kempeitai, and they were never seen again. So this guy was a double agent. And there was one person I knew personally who said, I knew this guy. I knew this guy was fishy. And this friend of mine was a journalist in the Manila Tribune at the time. And he said, I remembered, I couldn't figure out who he was. And then he looked at the back issues of the newspaper and found that this guy was charged with, what is this? He was charged with, not treason. He was charged with what is that? Fake contracts and you pay money to him and he doesn't come up with it. Estafa, yeah. So he was an estafador. So when this friend of mine saw him again, he said, this guy is estafador. He was charged before the war of illegitimate work, illegal stuff. And unfortunately, many of the guerrillas didn't know that at the time until it was too late. But to make matters short, he did not survive the war. We don't know exactly how he was killed. One story is that the guerrillas leaked information to the Japanese that he was actually really working with the guerrillas. And so he was arrested by the Kempeitai and killed. But we're not sure. He just disappeared and he vanished. So, Franco Vera Reyes, that's his full name.
On that note, I really would like to end. It's kind of late.
Wow.
And we have an exhibition. Professor Jose's remarks are just incredible. So let's give him a big hand.